The heat lay heavy over the valley, a stillness that seemed to press against the air itself. Dust clung to every surface, soft as ash, and the horizon shimmered like glass. The Marlowe Ranch stood at the far edge of that emptiness. 3 weathered buildings and a windmill that no longer turned. The boards on the porch were bleached pale by sun and wind, the windows filmed with years of grit. Nothing had moved there for a long time, except the faint sway of the dry grass and the sound of a loose shutter tapping against the wall. Evelyn Marlowe lived alone, though it was less a life than the slow continuation of one. The death of her husband had sealed the house in a silence that grew heavier with each passing season. The fields had gone to dust, the cattle sold off, the well half dry. Each morning she rose before dawn, lit the stove, and worked through the same narrow pattern of chores until evening fell again. Her hands were rough, her skin burned by the sun, and her eyes carried the pale emptiness of a sky that never changed. Sometimes, on rare days, she rode the wagon into town. She would buy salt, lamp oil, or coffee, and speak only when she had to. People there had stopped asking how she managed on her own. There was nothing left to say. She always returned before sunset, when the light stretched long across the valley and the shadows reached for the hills like dark water. That evening, the heat was worse than usual. The wind had died completely, and the air smelled of metal and sage. She was mending a fence when she saw a dark shape moving along the road, slow, unsteady, too heavy in the saddle. At first, she thought it was another drifter, one of the kind who came through looking for a night's shelter and whiskey. But as the figure drew closer, she saw the horses stumble, the way the rider clung to the horn, and the faint glint of something silver at his belt. The man reached the gate before the horse's legs gave out. The animal sank to its knees, throwing him into the dirt. He tried to stand, then fell again, the dust rising around him in a pale cloud. Evelyn stood motionless for a moment, her breath shallow, one hand on the worn stock of her rifle. The sun was low enough to paint the ground red, and the man's face, half covered in sweat and dust, looked like it had been carved out of that same clay. When she came closer, she saw the wound. A dark patch spread beneath his shoulder, the cloth torn and stiff with dried blood. A badge hung at his hip, bent, dulled, streaked with rust and crimson. The star of a U.S. Marshal. His eyes were open but unfocused, his lips moving faintly as if speaking to someone who wasn't there. The sound that left his throat was closer to a whisper than a word. She didn't ask who he was chasing or what had brought him this far into nowhere. There was only the man, the blood, and the gathering dusk. She lifted him by the arm, feeling the weight of his body sag against her, and half dragged, half carried him toward the house. Inside, the air was cooler, the smell of dust replaced by the faint scent of kerosene. She laid him on the narrow bed by the stove, tore open his shirt, and pressed a strip of linen against the wound. Water boiled on the fire, and the hiss of it filled the room. His breathing was shallow, erratic. She washed the blood away as best she could, her hands trembling not from fear, but from something quieter, more uncertain. The light from the lantern trembled across the walls, catching the dull shine of her wedding ring, the iron nails, and the glass jars lined on the shelf. Outside, the world darkened into violet and gray. The sound of coyotes carried through the distance, long, hollow cries that seemed to circle the valley. Evelyn sat by the bed, listening to his uneven breath. Each rise of his chest felt like a fragile argument against the night. The hours passed slowly. The moon rose, pale and low, cutting a thin line of silver through the cracks in the boards. The man stirred once, his hand twitching toward the badge, then fell still again. She stayed beside him, wiping the sweat from his forehead, refilling the basin, feeding the fire when it began to die. Her mind wandered to the years behind her, the nights she had spent waiting for her husband to return from drives that stretched too long, the mornings when she woke to an empty bed and the sound of hoofbeats fading into the distance. Now there was only this stranger, this wounded man who had fallen out of the horizon like a ghost. In the wavering light, his face looked peaceful, almost boyish. The blood had stopped flowing. His breathing steadied. She leaned back in the chair, exhaustion settling over her like dust, and watched the firelight flicker across the walls. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled. A storm gathering, though no rain had touched this land in months. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the pulse of the wind returning at last. The coyotes had gone quiet. The house, the man, and the desert all seemed to breathe together in a single fragile rhythm. When she opened her eyes again, the fire had burned low. The man was asleep, his face turned toward the wall, the badge glinting faintly at his side. She rose, covered him with a blanket, and stood for a long time by the window. The valley stretched out beneath the moon, endless and empty. The air smelled of dust and iron. It was the same world as before, silent, merciless, unchanged. But something in its stillness felt different, as if the long waiting of her life had shifted by the width of a breath. The night held its silence, and she let it hold her too, standing there until the first pale hint of dawn touched the farthest ridge of the desert. The morning came pale and windless, the kind of light that revealed everything but warmed nothing. The man was still there, asleep on the narrow bed, his breathing steadier now, his skin no longer gray. Evelyn stood by the stove, stirring the ashes back to life, watching the orange glow catch in the iron belly of the fire. Outside, the valley shimmered under a curtain of dust. The day was already rising hot. By noon he was on his feet. Weak but stubborn, he refused to rest any longer. She found him outside, mending the hinge on the corral gate with one good arm, the other bound in linen. He moved carefully, as if testing the limits of his own strength, and said nothing when she appeared. The silence between them felt heavy, but not hostile. Two lives moving around each other like the slow circling of planets. Days slipped into a rhythm without ever being agreed upon. He worked where work was needed, hauling water from the well, patching the roof, gathering wood from the dry riverbed. She cooked, cleaned, tended the chickens, and watched the dust rise behind him as he moved across the yard. His presence changed the air somehow, not with noise or talk, but with the weight of another heartbeat in a house long used to one. At dusk, they would sit apart, she on the porch and he near the barn, each facing the dying light. The land darkened into long blue shadows, and the wind came up carrying the smell of dry earth and mesquite. Sometimes she would look at him, the broad shoulders, the way his hands rested still after work, the faint tremor in them when she thought she wasn't watching. She wondered who he had been before he came down that road, what kind of men left a lawman bleeding in the dust. But she never asked. He slept in the small room behind the stable now, saying he preferred the air and the distance. She didn't argue. Some nights, lying awake, she heard the soft creak of the door and the sound of his boots crossing the yard. Then nothing, only the hush of the desert and the far cry of a night bird. Once, she rose and looked through the curtain. He was standing by the well, bareheaded, staring into the black water as if it might speak to him. The wind lifted the edge of his shirt, and for a moment he looked less like a man and more like something carved out of the dark itself. On the third day, the rhythm broke. He stood before her in the yard, hat in his hands, eyes lowered. He asked to stay. His voice was quiet, almost careful,
the words carried by the wind. He said he would work for his keep, no questions asked, no promises needed. She studied him for a long time, then nodded once. It wasn't mercy, not exactly. It was something closer to recognition. From then on, the days unfolded like beads on a string. The sun rose, the work began, the silence held. They spoke only when necessary, and yet the air between them thickened with all that was left unsaid. When she passed him a bucket or a tool, their hands brushed, brief, accidental, and both drew back as if from heat. But the next time, neither pulled away so quickly. The land seemed to breathe again under their labor. The fences stood straight. The roof no longer leaked. The horses grew calmer. Even the windmill groaned into motion after years of stillness, creaking as the blades caught the faintest breath of air. The sound of it filled the valley like the ticking of a slow, patient clock. Yet there was something in him that did not mend. Some days he moved easily, almost peaceful. Other days a shadow crossed his face when the dogs barked in the distance, or a rifle cracked far off on the hills. His jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. It wasn't fear, not quite, but the wary stillness of a man who had learned to listen for the wrong kind of silence. Evelyn saw it, though she pretended not to. She could feel it in the way his shoulders stiffened at sudden noise, the way his gaze followed any rider that passed along the distant road. At night, when she lay awake, she wondered who hunted him. Outlaws? A past mistake? A crime that had no clean side? But whatever truth lay behind his silence, she sensed that asking would only drive him farther into the dark. Her own heart betrayed her in quiet ways. She found herself waiting for his footsteps in the morning, for the sound of the well bucket creaking up the rope, for the way he paused before coming inside. When she looked at him, she felt both steadied and unmoored. The loneliness that had once felt like her only companion now pressed differently against her ribs, softer, but heavier. One afternoon, the sky turned copper. A dust storm rolled across the plain, swallowing the horizon. She hurried to gather the chickens, and he appeared beside her, pulling the doors closed, tying the shutters with old rope. The wind screamed, and the air filled with grit. They stood together in the darkened kitchen, the storm beating against the walls. The lantern flickered between them. He was close enough that she could smell the earth on his skin, the faint trace of smoke. Neither spoke. The storm passed, leaving the house covered in a fine film of sand. But long after it had gone, the silence inside still carried its echo. As days became weeks, she began to accept the presence of that silence. The man in the shadow of her days, the sound of a second cup placed on the table, the slow return of life to a place that had forgotten it. She didn't name the feeling that grew inside her, and neither did he. Names would have made it real, and real things in that land had a way of breaking. Still, sometimes, when the night wind moved through the valley and the coyotes cried in the distance, she could hear the faint rhythm of two hearts keeping time in the same dark. It frightened her, not because it was wrong, but because it was alive.
By late summer, the air hung still and thick with heat, the kind that clung to skin and turned the horizon to smoke. The grass around the ranch had burned to straw, and each step raised a ghost of dust. Evelyn rode into town once a week, as she always had, trading eggs and milk for coffee, flour, and salt. But that morning, as she tied her horse outside the store, she felt the weight of eyes on her before she even stepped inside. The talk had already reached them. News traveled like fire in that part of Texas, slow at first, then all at once. They said the marshal, John Bates, was dead, shot in a canyon west of Abilene. They said 3 men had vanished with him, men wanted for murder, men who would not be mourned. Some whispered that one of them still rode free, wearing a dead man's badge. Others said the law had buried its own mistake.
By the time Evelyn crossed the store's threshold, the story had grown teeth. The air inside was heavy with flour dust and tobacco smoke. She moved quietly between the shelves, taking what she needed. The storekeeper's wife, a thin woman with tired eyes, greeted her with a smile too careful to be kind. The men near the counter lowered their voices when she passed. No one said her name, but the silence carried it. She felt it like a shadow pressed against her back. Old Lamb was waiting outside when she returned to her horse. His hands shook on his cane and the brim of his hat sagged with age. He had known her husband once, ridden with him on cattle drives when the world was younger. His eyes, pale as worn glass, searched her face. He spoke softly, and his words carried the weight of something more than just gossip. She nodded once without answering. There was nothing to say. The ride back to the ranch was long and still. The wind had died entirely, and the land felt deserted, the sky too large, the earth too dry. When she reached the ridge above her property, she reined in the horse. From that height, she could see everything. The pale roof of the barn, the stillness of the yard, the faint shimmer of heat above the fences. Then she saw the tracks, fresh. A single horse had come down the road and stopped at her gate. The prints were deep, newer than the morning. Whoever had come had not stayed long. Her pulse slowed, not quickened. Fear was an old thing to her now, familiar as dust. She rode down, the sound of hooves muffled by sand, and dismounted near the porch. John was standing by the barn, shirt sleeves rolled, the hammer still in his hand. He looked at her as she approached, his face unreadable, the quiet in his eyes too steady to be peace. The air between them held the weight of everything unsaid. She didn't ask if he had seen them. She didn't need to. That evening, the sun bled out behind the hills, turning the world to copper and ash. They ate in silence. The only sound was the scrape of forks, the distant creak of the windmill turning. When night came, they moved to the porch, where the boards still held the day's warmth. He sat in the shadows, hat low, hands folded. She sat by the railing, watching the stars burn faintly through the dust in the sky. The crickets had gone quiet. Even the coyotes were silent, as if the desert itself was listening. The moon rose, pale and cold. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring into the darkness beyond the yard. His shoulders were tight, his body still in that way men get when they're waiting for something to find them. She knew then what he had not said, that someone had come looking, that whatever trail he had tried to bury had found its way back to him. She felt no anger, no betrayal, only a strange calm that spread through her like the slow cooling of metal. It wasn't that she trusted him completely, it was that she no longer cared what truth he carried. The world had already taken everything that could be taken from her. Fear had nothing left to claim. The wind rose again near midnight, carrying the scent of sage and faraway rain. The boards creaked under her bare feet as she stood, looking out across the land. The fences stretched in silver lines beneath the moon, and somewhere in the dark a horse snorted softly. She thought of the tracks by the gate, the men in town, the whisper of her name among strangers. For the first time in years, she didn't turn away from it. John remained where he was, a still figure against the dark. The lamplight from the window touched the edge of his face, the glint of metal on his hip. She realized that he had not taken off the badge, not the one crusted with dried blood, not once since the day he arrived. It hung beneath his coat, invisible but never gone. They stayed like that until the stars began to fade, listening to the land breathe around them. The silence between them was heavy, but it was no longer uncertain. It carried a shape now, like something forged in fire and left to cool. When dawn crept over the hills, Evelyn felt something inside her settle. The fear that had followed her since the news in town had burned itself out, leaving only clarity. She knew what it meant if they came, what the men would do, what John might have to become again. But she also knew what she would choose. The line between mercy and ruin had already been crossed long ago, somewhere she could no longer find her way back to. The sun broke, spilling red light over the plain. The air smelled of dust and iron. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a horse moved through the brush, its steps slow and deliberate. Evelyn turned toward the sound, her face unreadable. Behind her, John rose to his feet. The day had begun, and whatever waited on the horizon would find them both where they stood, unhidden, unafraid, and bound by the quiet that neither of them had tried to break.
The rain came without warning, rolling out of the western hills in a slow gray tide. It began as a whisper, a low murmur against the dust, then thickened until the air itself seemed to dissolve. The first drops hit the roof like thrown stones, darkening the boards, filling the cracks of the earth that had waited too long to be touched. The scent of wet soil rose heavy and raw, the smell of something waking after death. Evelyn stirred from sleep, the rhythm of it at first comforting, almost tender. Then she heard the hooves. 3 riders waited at the gate. Their shapes wavered through the haze of rain, long coats slick and dark, hats pulled low against the downpour. The horses stamped and tossed their heads, uneasy in the storm. Lightning flashed, and for an instant she saw their faces, hard, set, familiar in the way danger always was. One of them carried the posture of a man who once belonged to the law. His badge was gone, but the habit of authority clung to him like the mud on his boots. She knew, without needing to ask, why they had come. John stepped out from the barn. The rain soaked him instantly, flattening his hair against his forehead, darkening his shirt to the color of gunmetal. He moved slowly, unarmed, hands open at his sides. There was a kind of calm in his gait, the stillness of someone who had already made his peace with what was waiting. Evelyn stood at the window, the revolver cold and heavy in her palm. Her breath fogged the glass as she watched him walk across the yard toward the men who had once called him brother. Their voices were lost to the rain, only fragments reached her, shouts, gestures, the hard rhythm of men saying things that couldn't be unsaid. The tall one in front, the former deputy, leaned forward in his saddle, his face sharp with fury and pride. His hand dropped to his side, and that small motion, the quiet inevitability of it, made Evelyn's heart stop. The first shot cracked through the storm, loud enough to tear the sky. John staggered, his body folding as if the sound itself had struck him. Then came 2 more, wild, desperate, the kind fired not to kill but to survive. The horses screamed and reared. One of the riders went down hard, the other turned and fled into the sheets of rain, his shape swallowed by the distance. Evelyn was already moving. The door slammed behind her, the wind nearly tearing it from its hinges. Mud sucked at her boots as she ran, the rain lashing her face. The smell of gunpowder clung to the wet air, sharp and bitter. She saw John lying near the fence, his hand still gripping the revolver, his eyes open but unfocused. Steam rose from the ground around him, where blood met the warm rain. She dropped to her knees beside him, fingers trembling as she pressed against the wound. He tried to speak, but no sound came. The rain blurred everything, his face, the sky, her own vision. She slid her arms underneath him, the weight of him both familiar and unbearable, and pulled with all she had left. Somehow, through the mud and the water, she brought him back inside. The house smelled of wet wood and choke. She laid him on the bed, tore the fabric from his shoulder, and worked by the dim light of the lamp. Blood soaked through the cloth faster than she could stop it. She boiled water, wrapped his arm, changed the bandage, waited. His breathing came shallow, fading, then steadied again as if the rain outside lent it its rhythm. She sat beside him for hours, her back stiff, her hands red. The storm went on through the night. Water dripped from the eaves, pooled beneath the door, whispered across the windows. Each sound felt endless. Evelyn didn't move. She watched the rise and fall of his chest, the faint twitch of his fingers, the pulse in his throat. Sometimes she reached out and touched his hand, half to reassure herself he was still warm. There was no fear now, only the slow ache of waiting. Toward morning, the rain began to fade. The clouds thinned into a pale mist, the air cooling as if the world exhaled. She rose, opened the window, and let the dawn in. The smell of ash and wet earth filled the room. Outside, the valley glimmered under a new light, every blade of grass silvered with water. The bodies were gone. The storm had taken their traces, washed them into the dust and distance. John lay still, his skin pale against the sheets, his breath faint but present. The badge that once hung beneath his coat lay on the table beside him, darkened and scratched, the metal dull as bone. Evelyn sat again, the revolver resting on her knees, and watched the horizon brighten. The sun rose slowly, as it always did, burning through the remnants of rain until the world looked clean again.
The days after the rain settled into a silence that seemed to spread through the valley like smoke after a fire. The sky cleared, the air sharpened, and the earth hardened again beneath the sun. From the road, the house looked the same as ever, small, weather-beaten, half hidden behind a stand of brittle mesquite. But those who passed it now did not look too long. In town, the talk had returned, louder this time, heavier with certainty. They said there had been shooting near the Marlowe ranch, that men had gone out there and never come back. They said Evelyn Marlowe was harboring a killer. The sheriff came 3 days later, his horse slick with sweat, his face set in the practiced calm of a man used to seeing what others tried to hide. He searched the yard, the barn, the dry edges of the creek. He found the marks of hooves, the churned mud, a few empty shells half buried in the dirt. He asked questions Evelyn did not answer. The wounds in the earth spoke for themselves. When he left, he said nothing, but the look in his eyes said more than any accusation could. After that, the town turned its face away from her. The storekeeper, who once called her ma'am and smiled as he weighed her flour, began to serve her without a word. His wife avoided her eyes. When Evelyn asked for credit, he shook his head, though she'd never failed to pay. At the fairground, women who used to greet her with nods turned away to rearrange their baskets. Children who once waved as she passed now watched her from behind fences, their mothers pulling them close. She spoke to no one. She rode in, bought what she could, and left before the gossip had time to grow teeth again. Back at the ranch, the silence deepened. The chickens still scratched in the dirt, the windmill still creaked in the afternoon heat, and the world went on as though nothing had changed. But it had. Every evening, she worked until the light gave out, mending fences, stacking firewood, patching the roof where the rain had torn it. The rhythm of it steadied her hands, though her mind drifted elsewhere. Sometimes she would find herself standing still, hammer in hand, staring at the gate as if waiting for something she couldn't name. Nights were harder. The house felt too big again, the shadows too loud. She left the lamp burning longer than before, though there was no one to see it. Some nights, she walked out to the porch, wrapped in her husband's old coat, and watched the road. The wind carried the smell of dry grass, and the stars stretched endless above the hills. She listened for the sound of hooves, but the only thing she heard was the hum of insects and the slow beat of her own heart. The days slipped by, measured only by the lengthening shadows and the slow fade of summer. The wound in the ground where blood had mixed with rain dried and disappeared, covered by dust. The sheriff did not return. The town stopped speaking her name aloud, though she could still feel it whispered in the space behind her. She learned to live with the quiet, to move through it as through smoke, carefully, without stirring it too much. When the season began to turn, the air grew cleaner. Mornings came cold enough to leave frost on the troughs, and the sky opened wide above the valley, blue as steel. Evelyn felt something ease in her chest, not hope exactly, but the faint release that comes after long waiting. She began to sleep more deeply, though she still woke sometimes before dawn, heart racing at some sound she couldn't place. Then one evening, when the sun was sliding low behind the hills and the sky burned red at the edges, she heard it. Faint at first, then clearer. The slow, uneven rhythm of hooves on hard ground. She stepped onto the porch, her breath caught halfway on her throat. The sound drew closer, steady despite its weariness, until a shape appeared at the bend of the road. John rode out of the fading light, his hat pulled low, his coat torn and stiff with dust. His horse moved carefully, head bowed, ribs showing beneath its hide. He dismounted without speaking, his movements heavy but sure. The air between them was thick with all that didn't need to be said. His eyes met hers, and though his face was drawn and hollow, the wild edge that once lived there was gone. What remained was only weariness and a quiet acceptance. She looked at him and felt something shift inside her, like a door closing gently. There was no surprise, no joy, only the still certainty that he had come back because there was nowhere else left to go. He stood before her as if waiting for judgment, but she gave none. The distance between them was filled with rain, with blood, with the echo of every silence they had shared. He said nothing of where he had been or what had happened on the road. She did not ask. The questions belonged to another life, one that had already ended. Together they walked toward the house, their steps slow, the dust rising faintly beneath their boots. The door creaked open, the same as it had that first night when she had dragged him in from the storm. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of wood smoke. She set a lamp on the table and poured water into a basin, her hands steady. He washed the dirt from his face, the red from his hands, and sat at the edge of the bed. For a long time they didn't move, the silence between them neither heavy nor light, just true. Outside, the sun slipped fully behind the hills, and the valley sunk into the long blue of twilight. The world had gone quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for forgiveness. Evelyn stood at the window, watching the last of the light fade, her reflection barely visible in the glass. Behind her, John lay back, his breathing slow, his body still. When the first stars appeared, she turned from the window and sat beside him. His eyes were closed, but his hand found hers, rough and warm. She didn't pull away. The road had taken everything it could from them both. What remained was this: two people, bound by the silence that nearly destroyed them, sitting in a house, that the world had already forgotten. The night deepened, and the wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of autumn. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, faint and distant. She listened, her hands still resting in his, and thought that maybe, at last, the waiting was over.
Winter came early, carried on winds that smelled of iron and distant fire. The sky turned pale and brittle, and the plains to the north sent waves of dust and ash rolling over the valley. The earth lost its color, the trees thinned, and the river shrank to a silver thread winding between stones. The house stood alone against the cold, its walls humming softly when the wind pressed against them. Smoke rose from the chimney, dark and slow, drifting across the empty fields until it vanished into the gray. Inside, the silence had changed. It no longer felt sharp or hollow. It had softened, filled with the small sounds of living, the scrape of a chair, the hiss of the stove, the creak of a door in the wind. John moved through the days with the quiet focus of a man who had run out of reasons to run. He mended the well before the frost came, patched the roof again, and split enough wood to last the season. His hands were rough, his back stiff, but the work steadied him, gave the hours shape. Evelyn kept the house warm. She rose before dawn, lit the fire, and set the kettle to boil. She fed the hens that still lingered near the shed, though half had gone wild by now, roosting in the trees when the cold came down. When she worked, she moved slowly, methodically, as if each task carried weight beyond its purpose. Sometimes in the afternoons, she would sit by the window and mend an old shirt or sort through jars she'd kept since her mother's time. Small, fragile things that reminded her the world once held gentler days. They spoke little. Words had long ago lost their usefulness between them. But in their silence there was no longer distance. When he passed her by, their shoulders brushed lightly. When she set food on the table, he nodded without looking up, and she understood. In the evenings they sat near the fire, he with his head bowed, she watching the flames turn from gold to blue. The wind howled against the shutters, and the house seemed to breathe with them, old and tired, but still standing. The townspeople no longer mentioned their names. Whatever stories had been told had long since been replaced by newer gossip, fresher sins. Life in the valley moved forward in its slow, indifferent way. Trains still passed beyond the hills, carrying strangers who would never know the lives buried here. In town, the sheriff grew older and quieter. The storekeeper's son took over the business. The dust on the road covered everything equally, until memory itself felt like something left too long in the sun. Sometimes near dusk, John saddled his horse and rode toward the hills. He didn't say where he went, and Evelyn didn't ask. She would watch him from the porch as he disappeared into the dimming light, the sound of hoofs fading into the wide stillness. The sky burned red, then purple, then fell into gray. The horizon swallowed him whole, but she never felt fear. She knew the rhythm of his leaving, the pattern of his return. When he came back, often long after dark, she would hear the horse first, the tired snort, the jingle of reins, the quiet thud of hoofs on hard earth. He would unsaddle it, lead it to water, and then stand for a while near the gate, looking toward the empty road. She watched him sometimes, through the window, his shape caught in the glow of the lamp, a figure half claimed by the dark. He seemed smaller in those moments, as if the world had been quietly carving him away, piece by piece. The nights grew longer. Frost bloomed on the windows, turning the world outside into a blur of silver and shadow. Evelyn slept lightly, waking often to the sigh of the wind through the eaves. Sometimes she would find him sitting by the fire long after midnight, staring into the coals. His face looked softer in that light, as if the years had finally laid him down instead of carrying him forward. She never disturbed him. She would sit nearby, listening to the wood crackle, and wait until the first gray hint of morning touched the walls. One morning, snow came. Thin, uncertain flakes carried sideways by the wind. It dusted the fence posts, the troughs, the bare branches of the mesquite. The world grew quiet in a different way, like it was holding its breath. John watched it from the doorway, his hands buried deep in his coat. Evelyn stood behind him, her warmth faint against his back. For a long while they didn't move. The snow kept falling, and the sound of it, soft, fragile, nearly imagined, filled the space between them. In the days that followed, the cold settled deep into the ground. The horses grew restless, their breath visible in the dawn air. Evelyn's hands cracked from the frost, but she kept working, each motion slow and deliberate. John grew quieter still. When he rode out again, he stayed longer than before, sometimes gone until the stars were high. She no longer waited by the window. Instead, she tended the fire and kept the lamp lit, trusting the rhythm of his return. The hills in the distance wore a crown of white now, the road twisting between them like an old scar. It led nowhere anyone cared to go, just a stretch of earth fading into horizon. But to John it seemed to hold something he still owed the world, or maybe himself. He rode it often, tracing its curves until it vanished beneath his horse's hoofs. Out there, alone beneath the vast winter sky, he found the silence that he had carried for so long. Evelyn saw him ride that way one evening, when the sun lay low and the air glowed with the color of dying fire. The wind caught her hair and filled her eyes with dust. She watched until he became no more than a shape swallowed by distance. The road shimmered, fading into the haze, and the light turned everything the color of old copper. She didn't wave. She didn't call after him. She simply stood, her hand resting against the porch post, her breath white against the cold. She knew he would return before night, the same way she knew the stars would come and the fire would burn low. There was comfort in that certainty, not born of hope, but of understanding. Whatever bound them now was not love in the way the world named it. It was quieter, stripped of promise, shaped by the years and the silence they had learned to share. When he returned that evening, she was waiting by the hearth. He hung his coat, sat beside her, and together they watched the fire. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the plains, low, endless, familiar. The world had narrowed to this house, this moment, this fragile piece. The days would go on like that, one folding into the next. Seasons would shift, roads would fade, and names would be forgotten. But somewhere beyond the hills, where the road dissolved into dust and distance, their story would remain. Unwritten, unspoken, but alive in the quiet. It was not forgiveness that kept them there, nor love, nor fear. It was the simple act of staying, the quiet endurance of two lives bound by what the world could not see. And in that silence, beneath the wide and endless sky, they found what they had been running toward all along, a kind of peace that asked for nothing, that belonged to no one, a peace that waited for them where the road ended.
Don't slip away quietly. Subscribe.